Judge Franklin Pierce believed there was nothing more satisfying than teaching someone their place. For 23 years, he had presided over the courtroom of Ashford County, a polished chamber of dark oak benches and marble floors where every word he spoke carried the weight of authority. Lawyers feared embarrassing themselves in front of him. Defendants avoided meeting his eyes. And ordinary citizens understood very quickly that this was not a room where you challenged the judge. But the morning Emma Lawson spoke up at the town council meeting, Franklin Pierce felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Irritation. The council chamber had been crowded that evening, folding chairs packed tightly together, residents whispering about the new decision that would cut nearly $2 million from the public education budget. One by one, speakers approached the microphone. Most kept their comments short. A few praised the decision. Others complained politely. Then Emma Lawson stepped forward. She looked exactly like what she was, a high school English teacher who had come straight from work. A simple navy cardigan, comfortable flats, a stack of papers clutched in one hand. Her light brown hair pulled back in a loose knot. No one in the room paid much attention at first. Judge Pierce certainly didn't. He sat in the front row with the quiet confidence of someone used to being the most powerful person in any room. But then Emma began to speak. Her voice wasn't loud, yet every word carried clearly across the room. She spoke about the impact the budget cuts would have on textbooks, classroom sizes, and after-school programs. She cited specific statutes about how county funds could legally be allocated. That was the moment Pierce looked up. Slowly, carefully, because it was one thing for a teacher to complain about funding. It was another thing entirely for her to question the legality of a decision that had passed through his courtroom weeks earlier. Emma didn't raise her voice. She didn't insult anyone. But she did something far more dangerous. She calmly explained that the ruling approving the cuts might have overlooked a procedural requirement in state law. The room grew quieter with each sentence. Pierce felt the attention shift toward him, toward the judge whose decision she was quietly dismantling in front of half the town. He told himself it was nothing, just a teacher repeating something she read online. But when Emma finished, a few people actually nodded. One council member leaned toward another, whispering. And in that moment, Franklin Pierce made a decision. Emma Lawson would learn that challenging a judge in public came with consequences. The next morning, while sunlight filtered through the tall courthouse windows, Pierce stood behind his desk reviewing a thin folder that had just been placed there. A minor traffic citation connected to Emma Lawson. Normally, it would have been handled with a small fine, maybe a brief appearance. But Pierce tapped his pen slowly against the desk as an idea formed. A few procedural adjustments. A slightly altered charge. A formal summons that would require her to appear directly in his courtroom. Perfectly legal on paper. Embarrassing in practice. He imagined the scene already. The quiet teacher standing alone at the defendant's table, realizing too late that she had stepped far outside her place. What Judge Franklin Pierce didn't know was that Emma Lawson understood the law far better than he assumed. And the courtroom he controlled so confidently was about to become the last place he wanted to be. Emma Lawson returned to her classroom the next morning as if nothing unusual had happened. The hallways of Ashford High School were already alive with the usual morning energy. Lockers slammed shut. Students laughed as they hurried toward first period. The smell of fresh coffee drifted from the teacher lounge down the corridor. For Emma, this place had always felt steady and predictable, a quiet world where the most important battles were about literature essays and overdue homework rather than public arguments in crowded council chambers. She unlocked the door to room 214 and stepped inside. Sunlight poured through the tall windows, stretching across rows of wooden desks that had been used by generations of students. On the whiteboard at the front of the room, she wrote the day's lesson in careful handwriting, Justice and Moral Courage in American Literature. It was a topic she loved teaching because it always sparked discussion. Many of her students came from working families who understood fairness better than most adults in positions of authority. As the bell rang, students filtered into the room and took their seats. A few greeted her with cheerful good mornings. One student asked if they were finally going to finish the debate about To Kill a Mockingbird. Emma smiled and nodded. The conversation about justice had continued long after the bell the day before, which always meant the lesson had reached them. What no one in the room knew was that Emma Lawson herself had once stood in a very different classroom nearly 10 years earlier. Back then she had not been studying literature. She had been studying constitutional law. The memory flashed briefly through her mind as she placed a thick novel on her desk. Law school had been a world of endless case studies, long nights, and lectures about the structure of justice in America. Emma had graduated near the top of her class, a fact that surprised many people who knew her now only as a quiet English teacher in a small town. But life had taken a different direction after her grandfather became ill. He had been the one who first inspired her love for the law, a retired public defender who believed that the legal system should protect ordinary people who could not always defend themselves. When his health declined, Emma had returned to Ashford to help care for him. Teaching became her way of staying in the community while still sharing the ideas that mattered most to her. The law books never disappeared from her life completely. They remained carefully organized on a shelf in the small living room of her apartment, their pages filled with notes she had written years earlier. But to everyone else, Emma Lawson was simply the kind teacher who encouraged thoughtful discussion and stayed late after school, helping students revise essays. Midway through her second class of the morning, a quiet knock appeared at the classroom door. The school secretary stood in the hallway holding a small envelope. Emma stepped outside to receive it, thanking her politely. The envelope was official, thick cream paper stamped with the seal of the Ashford County Court. Emma paused for a moment before opening it. Inside was a formal notice requiring her appearance in court 3 days later regarding a citation that had suddenly been elevated into a far more serious legal matter. She read the document twice, then a third time. Her expression remained calm, but something behind her eyes sharpened, because the language of the summons contained several details that did not quite make sense. Emma folded the paper carefully and placed it back into the envelope. Inside the classroom, her students waited for the discussion to continue. She returned to the whiteboard and picked up her marker, but now a quiet realization had begun to settle in her mind. Someone in the courthouse had changed something, and whoever had done it believed she would not understand what they had just started. Emma Lawson finished the school day exactly the way she always did, patiently answering the last student question before the final bell echoed through the hallway. One by one, the students gathered their backpacks and hurried toward the exit, their conversations fading down the corridor. Within minutes, the classroom became quiet again. The late afternoon sun stretched across the desks, turning the dust in the air into thin ribbons of light. Emma remained standing near the whiteboard for a moment, listening to the building settle into that familiar end-of-day silence. Then she reached into her bag and removed the envelope from the courthouse. She opened it again, this time reading every line slowly. The wording was precise, but precision was exactly what made the document strange. The original traffic citation she remembered receiving 2 weeks earlier had been routine, nothing more than a minor issue involving a parking meter that had expired while she was grading papers at a coffee shop. The notice she now held in her hands described something very different. The citation had been reclassified under a procedural statute normally reserved for repeated violations and court defiance. Emma's eyes moved carefully across the legal language. A subtle change in the wording shifted the situation from a simple administrative fine into a mandatory court appearance before a county judge. The detail that caught her attention most was the assigned courtroom number printed at the bottom of the page. Courtroom 3. She did not need to check the courthouse directory to know who presided there. Franklin Pierce. The realization settled quietly but firmly in her mind. Across town, the courthouse stood on a small hill overlooking the square, its stone steps worn smooth by decades of visitors. Inside that building, Judge Pierce had already begun imagining how the hearing would unfold. In his office earlier that afternoon, he had reviewed the case file again with calm satisfaction. A small procedural adjustment had transformed a forgettable citation into something that would require Emma Lawson to stand in front of him and explain herself. On paper, the process remained perfectly acceptable. The law allowed judges wide discretion in how certain violations were handled. Pierce leaned back in his chair as sunlight filtered through the tall windows behind his desk. He pictured the teacher from the council meeting walking nervously into his courtroom, realizing too late that challenging authority carried consequences. To him, it was a simple lesson in respect. Back in the quiet classroom, Emma folded the document and placed it carefully into her bag. Her reaction was not panic. It was calculation. She locked the classroom door and walked slowly down the empty hallway toward the parking lot. The late autumn air outside was cool and crisp, carrying the scent of fallen leaves across the campus lawn. As she drove home through the small streets of Ashford, her thoughts moved steadily through the language of the summons. There were details that did not align with the original citation, dates that had been altered, a clause that had been inserted to justify the hearing. By the time Emma parked in front of her modest apartment building, she already understood something important. This situation had not happened by accident. Someone inside the courthouse had carefully arranged it. Later that evening, Emma sat at the small wooden desk beside her living room window and opened a box that had not been touched in years. Inside were the law school notebooks she had kept from long nights of studying case law and court procedure. She turned on the desk lamp and began reading again, page by page, statute by statute. Because if someone had decided to bring her into a courtroom on purpose, then they were about to discover that Emma Lawson knew exactly how a courtroom worked. The small desk lamp in Emma Lawson's apartment remained on long after midnight. Outside her window, the quiet streets of Ashford were nearly empty, illuminated only by the occasional passing headlights and the soft glow of streetlights reflecting off parked cars. Inside the apartment, the air carried the faint scent of old paper as Emma turned another page of a law textbook that had not been opened in years. The thick volume rested beside several notebooks filled with carefully written notes from her time in law school. Her handwriting moved across the margins of the page again as she reviewed the statute referenced in the summons. At first glance, the charge appeared legitimate. But the more she examined the wording, the more the pattern revealed itself. The procedural clause that escalated the citation required a specific filing sequence, and according to the document she had received, that sequence had been altered. Emma leaned back in her chair and looked toward the shelf across the room where her grandfather's framed photograph stood beside a row of worn legal books. He had spent his career defending ordinary people who could not afford powerful attorneys, and he had taught Emma something that most law students did not fully understand until much later in their careers. The law was not only about rules. It was about precision. A single misplaced line in a document could change the entire meaning of a case. Emma returned her attention to the summons and studied the timestamp printed near the bottom of the page. That detail alone raised another question. According to the record, the modification had been filed late in the evening the day after the council meeting. That was the same evening Judge Franklin Pierce had left the chamber with an expression that clearly showed he had not appreciated her comments. Across town inside the courthouse, Pierce had ended his workday hours earlier with quiet satisfaction. He had reviewed the docket for the upcoming week and paused briefly when he reached the entry bearing Emma Lawson's name. The hearing was scheduled for Thursday morning at 9 o'clock in courtroom 3. To Pierce, it was a simple matter of maintaining authority. People who publicly challenged a judge sometimes needed a reminder about how the legal system functioned. He closed the case folder and placed it neatly on the corner of his desk, already confident that the outcome would be straightforward. Meanwhile, Emma continued working at the desk beside her window, carefully comparing the summons to the official statute from the state legal database on her laptop. The more she examined the structure of the filing, the more the inconsistencies stood out. The document had been written in a way that looked correct to someone unfamiliar with court procedure, but the language contained several subtle errors that only someone trained in legal documentation would immediately recognize. Emma slowly closed the book in front of her and allowed herself a small, thoughtful smile. Whoever had prepared the paperwork had expected her to panic or hire an attorney without examining the details too closely. Instead, she now understood exactly what had happened. Someone had attempted to create a legal trap, assuming the target would not know how to recognize it. Emma stood and walked to the shelf where her grandfather's books were kept. She ran her fingers along the worn spines before selecting one of the old reference volumes he used to carry to court. When she returned to the desk, she opened a fresh notebook and began outlining several key points that would become important during the hearing. The courthouse might belong to Judge Franklin Pierce, but the law itself did not belong to anyone. And by the time the hearing arrived, Emma Lawson intended to remind the courtroom of that simple fact. By the time the next morning arrived, Emma Lawson had already slept only a few hours, yet her mind felt unusually clear. The early sunlight spilled across her small kitchen table where several open law books remained exactly where she had left them. Her notebook lay beside them, filled with careful lines of handwritten notes. Each page contained precise references to statutes, filing procedures, and the exact legal sequence that should have occurred before a minor citation could ever become a mandatory court appearance. Emma closed the notebook slowly and glanced at the clock on the wall. It was a little past 6 in the morning, just enough time for coffee before leaving for school. Outside her apartment window, the quiet street of Ashford was beginning to wake up. A delivery truck rolled past. A neighbor walked a small dog along the sidewalk. To anyone watching, Emma Lawson appeared to be nothing more than a teacher preparing for another ordinary day. At the courthouse across town, Judge Franklin Pierce arrived shortly before 8, as he always did. The courthouse doors opened with a familiar creak as he stepped inside, carrying a leather briefcase and the quiet authority that had followed him for decades. The staff in the hallway greeted him respectfully. A clerk handed him the morning docket as he walked toward his office. Several routine hearings filled the schedule, along with a few minor disputes that would likely be resolved in minutes. Near the middle of the page sat the entry that caught his eye again. Emma Lawson. The judge paused briefly, his expression calm but satisfied. The hearing was still 2 days away, yet he already imagined how the situation would unfold. A brief explanation from the bench. A reminder about court authority. Perhaps a small fine or a public warning. Nothing severe. Just enough to make certain that the teacher who questioned him at the council meeting would remember that a courtroom was not a place for casual criticism. Meanwhile, Emma arrived at Ashford High School and stepped into her classroom with the same quiet composure she carried every day. Students slowly filled the room as the bell rang. The lesson began with a discussion about moral courage and literature, but Emma noticed her thoughts returning occasionally to the hearing that awaited her later in the week. Not with fear, with curiosity, because the deeper she examined the summons, the more one detail continued to stand out. Whoever had modified the filing believed the document would never be closely inspected. That assumption alone revealed something about the person behind it. After the final class ended that afternoon, Emma returned home and opened her laptop again. She accessed the public court record system for Ashford County and searched the digital filing history connected to her citation. The timeline appeared on the screen in a neat column of entries. The original citation from the parking officer. The routine administrative record. Then the unexpected modification that elevated the case into a courtroom hearing. Emma leaned closer to the screen and examined the metadata attached to the filing. A quiet realization settled in her mind. The modification had not been submitted by a clerk. It had been entered directly through a judicial authorization code. Only one person in that courthouse had the authority to issue that specific adjustment without additional review. Emma sat back in her chair, absorbing the information carefully. A crosstown Judge Pierce believed he had arranged a small demonstration of authority that would remind a schoolteacher not to question his decisions in public. But the truth had already begun revealing itself piece by piece. And by the time Emma Lawson closed her laptop that evening, she understood exactly who had created the trap waiting inside courtroom 3. Thursday morning arrived with a pale gray sky hanging over the town of Ashford, and the courthouse steps were already busy with people arriving for their scheduled hearings. Lawyers in dark suits climbed the stone staircase while clerks carried folders through the heavy wooden doors. Inside, the polished marble floors reflected the quiet hum of conversation that filled the lobby. Courtroom 3 sat at the end of a long hallway where the tall windows allowed thin bands of sunlight to stretch across the wooden benches. At precisely 9 o'clock, Judge Franklin Pierce entered from the side door behind the bench, his black robe falling neatly over his shoulders as he took his seat. The courtroom rose respectfully before settling again into silence. Pierce adjusted the stack of files in front of him and began calling the first few cases with practiced efficiency. Minor disputes were resolved quickly. Small fines were issued. The rhythm of the courtroom moved exactly as it always had for years. Then the clerk read the next name from the docket. Emma Lawson. A quiet murmur passed through the room as Emma stepped forward from the gallery. She wore the same simple composure she carried in her classroom, a modest gray coat over a white blouse, her hair tied back neatly. There was no lawyer beside her, no sign of nervousness in her posture. To most people watching, she appeared to be exactly what Judge Pierce had expected. An ordinary citizen facing the intimidating structure of the courtroom alone. Pierce looked down at the file briefly before lifting his eyes toward her. His voice carried calmly across the chamber. Miss Lawson, You are appearing today regarding a citation that has been elevated due to procedural concerns. Do you understand the matter before the court? Emma nodded once. Yes, Your Honor. Her voice was steady and clear. Pierce leaned back slightly in his chair, studying her expression. Very well. The court will proceed. He expected hesitation, perhaps confusion about the legal language in the document. Instead, Emma reached into a small folder she had carried with her and placed several neatly organized papers on the defendant's table. A few people in the gallery leaned forward with quiet curiosity. Pierce noticed the movement, but dismissed it. Miss Lawson, he continued, you may explain why this citation should not be upheld under the current filing. For a brief moment the room became very still. Emma looked toward the bench, her expression thoughtful rather than defensive. Your Honor, before addressing the citation itself, I would like to clarify a procedural matter related to the filing that scheduled this hearing. The words were polite, respectful, yet something about them shifted. The atmosphere inside the courtroom. Pierce narrowed his eyes slightly. Procedural matter. Emma nodded and lifted one of the documents from her folder. Yes, Your Honor. Specifically the sequence in which the modification to the citation was entered into the court record. A faint ripple of interest moved through the benches behind her. Pierce felt the first small flicker of irritation, though his voice remained controlled. The court has already reviewed the filing, Miss Lawson. Emma met his gaze calmly. I understand that, Your Honor. However, the statute referenced in the modification requires a verification step that does not appear in the record. For the first time since the hearing began, the judge paused. The silence that followed was subtle but unmistakable. Because the quiet teacher standing alone at the defendant's table was not speaking like someone unfamiliar with the law. And in that moment, Judge Franklin Pierce began to realize that the hearing he had arranged might not unfold the way he had imagined. The silence that followed Emma Lawson's words lingered across courtroom 3 like a sudden change in air pressure. For years the room had followed a predictable rhythm where the judge spoke and everyone else listened. Now something unfamiliar had entered the space. Judge Franklin Pierce leaned forward slightly, his fingers resting on the edge of the bench as he studied the woman standing at the defendant's table. A moment earlier he had been prepared to move quickly through the hearing, deliver a brief lecture about legal responsibility, and end the matter within minutes. Instead, the quiet schoolteacher had just questioned the foundation of the very document that brought her there. Pierce cleared his throat softly. The court record has already been reviewed, Miss Lawson. If you wish to challenge the citation, you may address the facts of the violation. Emma remained calm, her posture steady as she held the document in her hand. Your Honor, I fully intend to address the citation. However, the legality of the hearing itself must be established first. The words were delivered respectfully, yet they carried a precision that caused several people in the gallery to glance at one another. Pierce noticed the shifting attention in the room. He had presided over thousands of hearings and understood how quickly an audience could sense uncertainty. That was not something he allowed to happen in his courtroom. Miss Lawson, he said carefully, the court does not require a lecture on procedure. Emma nodded politely, almost as if she had expected that response. Of course, Your Honor, which is why I brought the relevant statute with me. She lifted a small bound copy of the state legal code and placed it on the table in front of her. The sound of the book touching the wood echoed softly in the quiet room. According to Section 18 subsection 4 of the County Judicial Procedures Act, any modification that escalates a minor citation into a mandatory court hearing requires a verification filing submitted by a clerk within 24 hours of the change. Emma opened the book and turned it slightly so the page faced the bench. That verification does not appear in the public record connected to this case. The judge's expression tightened almost imperceptibly. Around the courtroom the stillness deepened. A clerk seated to the side quietly flipped through a copy of the same statute book, clearly following Emma's reference. Pierce spoke again, his voice steady but slower now. The court is aware of its procedures. Emma inclined her head slightly. I do not doubt that, Your Honor. However, the digital record shows the modification was entered directly under a judicial authorization code rather than through the clerk verification required by statute. The gallery had become completely silent. Even the faint rustle of papers had stopped. Emma continued speaking with the same measured calm. That alone would normally invalidate the escalation of the citation. But there is another issue as well. She lifted a second document from her folder and held it where the clerk could see it. The timestamp attached to the modification places the entry at 8:37 in the evening on the day after the council meeting. The courthouse filing office closes at 5:30. The clerk looked down at the page and then back toward the bench. Judge Pierce felt the faintest tightening in his chest as the implications settled across the room. Because for the first time in many years, someone standing in his courtroom was not simply defending themselves. They were quietly dismantling the structure he had arranged around them. And Emma Lawson had not even begun presenting the most important part of her argument yet. For several seconds after Emma Lawson finished speaking, the courtroom remained completely silent. The stillness felt heavier than before, though the air itself had thickened. Judge Franklin Pierce sat motionless behind the bench, his eyes fixed on the documents resting in Emma's hands. Around the room, people shifted slightly in their seats, sensing that the routine hearing had quietly transformed into something far more serious. The clerk at the side desk looked again at the timestamp Emma had pointed out, then back toward the judge with visible uncertainty. Pierce finally leaned forward, his voice carefully controlled. "Miss Lawson, you are suggesting that the court itself acted improperly." Emma did not hesitate. "No, Your Honor. I am pointing out that the documented process does not match the procedure required by statute." Her tone remained calm, almost gentle, yet every word landed with precise clarity. The judge glanced down at the file in front of him, turning a page slowly. On paper the citation still appeared valid, but the questions Emma had raised were now echoing through the room. The verification step she mentioned was indeed absent, and the timestamp she referenced was visible in the electronic record. Pierce looked toward the clerk. "Please confirm the filing sequence for this case." The clerk adjusted her glasses and typed quickly on the computer terminal beside her desk. The faint tapping of keys sounded unusually loud in the silent courtroom. After a moment, she cleared her throat softly. "Your Honor, the record indicates the escalation was authorized directly through a judicial access code. The required clerk verification does not appear in the entry." A quiet murmur rippled across the gallery benches. Pierce raised a hand immediately, restoring silence. But the calm authority that normally filled his voice had begun to thin slightly. Emma waited respectfully before speaking again. "Your Honor, I also reviewed the procedural guideline referenced in the escalation notice. According to subsection 7, a modification entered outside standard filing hours must include a documented explanation for urgency." She lifted another sheet from her folder and placed it gently on the table. "That explanation is also absent from the record." The clerk leaned forward to examine the document Emma had presented. Her eyes moved across the page before she looked up again, clearly uncomfortable. "The explanation field is blank, Your Honor." For the first time since the hearing began, Judge Pierce did not respond immediately. His gaze shifted from the clerk to the papers on the defendant's table and finally back to Emma Lawson herself. The quiet teacher stood exactly where she had been from the beginning, composed and patient, as though she were discussing a point of literature in a classroom rather than confronting a judge in his own courtroom. Pierce had expected confusion, perhaps embarrassment. Instead, he was facing someone who understood the legal framework surrounding the case with unsettling precision. Emma spoke once more, her voice still respectful, but now carrying a deeper weight. "Your Honor, the law requires that every defendant receive a fair and properly documented process. When a filing bypasses the safeguards written into the statute, the legitimacy of the hearing itself becomes uncertain." The room had grown so quiet that even the faint ticking of the courtroom clock could be heard against the far wall. Several people in the gallery exchanged glances, their earlier curiosity turning into open fascination, because what they were witnessing was no longer a simple citation hearing. The quiet woman standing at the defendant's table had just placed the entire procedure of the courtroom under scrutiny, and everyone present could see that Judge Franklin Pierce was now the one searching for the next move. The courtroom clock continued ticking steadily against the far wall as the silence stretched across courtroom 3. Judge Franklin Pierce remained seated behind the bench, his hands resting on the open file in front of him. For decades he had controlled the rhythm of this room with quiet certainty. Yet now the atmosphere felt different. The quiet teacher standing at the defendant's table had not raised her voice once, had not shown even the slightest sign of anger, yet she had managed to shift the focus of the entire hearing with nothing more than carefully chosen facts. Pierce finally straightened slightly in his chair and looked toward the clerk again. Please read the verification entry once more. The clerk hesitated before responding. Your Honor, there is no verification entry attached to the escalation of the citation. The original violation is documented, but the procedural requirement referenced in subsection 4 is not present in the record. A faint murmur moved through the gallery again before fading into silence. Emma Lawson waited patiently. She did not interrupt. She simply allowed the weight of the information to settle into the room. Pierce turned another page in the file, but there was nothing new to discover there. The paperwork appeared exactly as Emma had described it. The escalation had been authorized through a direct judicial code, entered late in the evening, without the clerk verification that the statute clearly required. For a moment the judge said nothing. Then he looked toward Emma again, studying her with a different expression than before. Miss Lawson, he said slowly, you appear to have a detailed understanding of court procedure. Emma inclined her head slightly. I studied constitutional law before becoming a teacher, Your Honor. The quiet statement created another ripple of surprise in the gallery benches. Several people exchanged glances, suddenly realizing that the calm woman they had assumed to be an unprepared defendant had been navigating the hearing with professional precision from the very beginning. Pierce closed the case file in front of him and rested his hands on the bench. The authority in his voice returned, though now it carried a more measured tone. After reviewing the procedural concerns raised in this hearing, the court finds that the escalation of this citation did not follow the statutory verification process required under county judicial procedure. Therefore, the escalation is invalid. The matter will be returned to its original administrative status and resolved through the standard citation process. The words echoed softly across the chamber. The clerk made a note in the record while several observers in the gallery leaned back in their seats, absorbing what had just happened. Emma gathered the papers from the table calmly, placing them back into her folder with careful movements. She did not celebrate. She did not say anything further. When she looked toward the bench, her voice remained respectful. Thank you for reviewing the matter carefully, Your Honor. Pierce gave a small nod. The hearing is concluded. The gavel tapped once against the wooden block, a sound that seemed quieter than usual in the large room. As Emma walked toward the exit, the sunlight from the tall courthouse windows stretched across the marble floor in long, bright lines. A few people watched her pass, their expressions thoughtful, almost reflective. Because only minutes earlier many of them had expected to witness a simple case of a citizen being corrected by the authority of the court. Instead, they had watched a quiet woman remind the entire room of something far more important. Authority alone does not define justice. Understanding the law does. And that morning in Ashford County, the person who understood it best had not been sitting behind the bench.